Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. I'm reviewing this very interesting book in the summer of 2020, the end of the main lockdown period of COVID 2019 pandemic times. And I've found this book, Ong, on tracing, to be a really interesting book, which I think will be of great assistance to those practitioners and law students who struggle with the concept of tracing both at common law and in equity. And I say that because I've taught this subject. It's not the easiest of subjects, it's an interesting subject, but it's not the easiest. The book comes to us from Australia, from the Federation Press. They produce some really high quality titles, and this one is very much in that league because Professor Ong knows his subject and he's able to communicate it well. It's not a big book, but it's an important one. I've given the review title for our book review, A Valuable Resource for Chancery Practitioners from the Federation Press. Let's look at the book first. It's a hardback. There's the front of the book. There's the spine. There's nothing on the back. It's a hardback. Lovely paper as usual. Very well structured. It's 200 odd pages long. There's a useful little index at the back by page numbering. There's not a lot in it. The index, as you can see, it starts there, and then you can see how the book is structured. You've got footnoting, a lot of footnoting, because there's a lot of case law which is mentioned. If I go to the front of the book, you can see there's the front page there. Professor Denis Ong has produced, I think, a first-rate book. That's the blurb about Federation Press. And there's the content section. It starts with tracing at common law, then goes into tracing in equity. Then it starts looking at a whole range of other issues and ends up with constructive trusts towards the end and the statute of limitations. Then there's the index. There's a preface which sets out in some detail what individual chapter offers. The preface being written in September last year. I'm recording this in the summer of 2020. The table of cases is very substantial, quite a lot of case law you will recognise. Again, it's a small book, so it's not a difficult book to read, so you can get through it at one sitting. Some statutes, basically mainly from obviously from the Commonwealth and Australia, but also some from the United Kingdom. Then you go straight into chapter 1. You can see a lot of footnoting, and I found the one thing I did find, which I shall mention again, is a very useful reference to case law, both Australian, of course, and English case law. So in this short review, what do I think of this book? Because I say that Professor Denis Ong is on superb form writing this new work on tracing from the Federation Press. He's well known to many people for a large amount of other works, but this one took my attention because tracing is an area I've lectured in, and it's an area that I've always found quite interesting. Because in some ways it's a bit like a mathematical puzzle, if you like, in the tracing or following methodically everything back when you're trying to look at the problem that you're actually confronted with. And this actually is the first scholarly book, monograph, published in Australia to analyse and explain the complex principles relating to the tracing of ownership of property, both at common law and in equity. That's what we've got here, the tracing of ownership of property. Notice all of these words, common law and in equity. We feel, of course, it will be of great assistance to both new and seasoned equity practitioners nationally and internationally, and that's the reason I'm reviewing this book in the England and Wales jurisdiction. Ong's definition of tracing are, I think, most helpful, and they start off in the first two chapters, and I'm going to quote a little bit because this gives you an idea for those who are new to the concept of tracing. He describes tracing at common law where, quote, the owner of an item of property is able to follow, or alternatively expressed, to trace that property into any other item of property that is proven to have been acquired by the use of the former. I hope that is clear. In other words, you're going back. The way I do it is I say you're going back into the past to try and follow the trail. It's rather like actually tracing who sent you an email. If you've had a problem with emails and you want to find out where it's come from, you're doing a trace because you're going back in the history of the email and where it's actually come from, especially if it's an international one. that may be of some help to more modern practitioners. Ong concludes then with common law tracing that the property so acquired will be owned by the owner of the property that has been used to acquire it. So that is the standard rigid common law rule. Thus, the original item of property is able to be so followed or traced irrespective of whether its use to acquire the new item of property was or was not authorised by the owner of the original item of property. So I hope you're following me so far, because this is where the difficulty starts. You're talking about an item of property and whether it's been authorised or not by the person who is the owner of the original item of property. And if I can compare that with, for instance, the title to property, which you might have in the law of contract, those of you who've done contract will know from the elements of contract law that the basis there is that you transfer a good quality title to the property or not. So in many ways we're looking at the originality of where the property comes from. And so to complement the common law definition in chapter 1, Professor Ong then goes on in chapter 2 to look at tracing in equity, which ameliorates, I suggest, the common law rule, which of course does not permit following or tracing property which has been mixed with other property of the same kind. That's where the equitable jurisdiction comes in, and that's the beauty of this book, because he explains that, I think, very well indeed. Now, there are 10 chapters in about 200 pages, beginning with an analysis of tracing at common law, then the tracing in equity, which are the two. In fact, the first chapter is a very long chapter, and that is very much an important part of the book right at the beginning. As I say, it's easy to read through. It's not difficult. I found it quite easy to zip through. There's an excellent exposition of the rule in Clayton's case from 1816, which is set out in chapter 7, which I think students will find most helpful. Again, I don't think it's a particularly difficult rule, but when I first studied trusts and equity, I found it very, very difficult. I did it by distance learning, so I didn't have any lectures, and it really was difficult. I did find, attending some lectures much later, many years later, that a lot that I had found difficult to understand became much more understandable. And I think the book that we've got from Professor Ong does the same thing, in that he's actually helped us immensely, because in addition to things like the rule in Clayton's case, you've got commentary on case law precedents, which I think remain an impressive part of what is a short but valuable work. The topics addressed by the professor in his characteristically clear and forthright manner, I thought I'd put that in, include consideration of both Australian and English authorities on what would be the following main points of interest, depending on what researchers or practitioners are looking for. They'd be these: the differences between tracing at common law and in equity, whether there is any distinction between tracing and following, whether backward tracing, and that's later in the book, is conceptually sound, that's an intellectual argument, a jurisprudential argument effectively. Situations where tracing is impossible, tracing the ownership of property into bank accounts, also again a very difficult area internationally with the global economy we now have, and other assets of course therewith, and the relationship between tracing and constructive trusts. I found that quite interesting, because again, constructive trusts themselves are a creature of course of the courts effectively, and they are very, very interesting as a subject in their own right, a popular subject with the academic world, and funny enough, we do get that in practice. I've had a number of cases where a constructive trust has been held to exist for various reasons, so it's not something that's purely and simply academic. You chaps who are actually practicing will hopefully see. And of course the application of the statute of limitations at the end of the book to tracing claims is also, I think, well covered. So let me conclude by saying that this is Ong's 8th major treatise in private law, and it complements the earlier works which now include trusts in Australia, equity, specific performance, subrogation, rescission, contribution and rectification. So he's built up a fairly good library of treaties, and we consider that this one, Ong on tracing, will be a valuable resource for commercial lawyers, barristers, legal researchers, and of course members of the judiciary. The law, as he says, is stated as abstracted from materials accessible to him as at the 2nd of September 2019, and the date of publication of this hardback volume is the 28th of November 2019, and I'm recording this in the summer of 2020. There's the book again. There's the spine. There's nothing much on that. Let me just open it in the middle. We're looking here, Tracing Inequity. This is interesting again. Re Hallett. This is about fiduciary relationships. Re Hallett, and Master of the Rolls, Lord Sir George Jessel, as he then was, setting out basically the position in Re Hallett, which will be a case well known to you. A lot of these cases are cases which both Australians and English practitioners will know about, because they are cases which have established what the law actually is. And then you go over to a number of other cases. Some of them are quite old. No distinction between following and tracing. I thought that was an interesting point as well. Again, he's taken judgments and used them, I think, very well indeed. And again, you've got Jessel mentioned again in tracing into banks and other assets. Again, I think that's an important area too, because you're looking at the chain. When you're looking at tracing, you're looking at the chain all the way through. I've been very impressed with this. I love the subject of tracing anyway, and I think it's a really interesting area. And I think this book helps immensely. So a very big thank you to Professor Denis Ong. Very grateful to you for this, Denis, and also to the Federation Press for sending this book to me for review. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.